After studying this module, you shall be able to know about disaster and its types, procedure of disaster victim identification, collection of antemortem and postmortem data, role of various personals in DVI operation. Now onwards, I will use the term DVI for disaster victim identification. Disasters, whether natural, technological or man-made, are unfortunately a fact of life. Disaster victim identification, that is DVI, normally the responsibility of the police, is a difficult and demanding exercise which can only be brought about to a successful conclusion if properly planned, and which has to involve the active participation of many other agencies. The ultimate aim of all DVI operations must invariably be to establish the identity of every victim by comparing and matching accurate antemortem and postmortem data. Now let us see the definition of disaster. Any occurrence which presents a serious threat to the health of the community, disruption to the service, or causes or is likely to cause such number or types of casualties as to require special arrangements to be implemented by hospitals, ambulance services or the health authorities. It can be divided into two types, that is, one is natural, another is the man-made. When we talk about the natural disasters, it includes the flood like tsunami, earthquake, avalanche, volcano, especially lahars. The man-made disasters include the various fire incidences like Upahar tragedy, what we witnessed in Delhi itself, in Upahar cinema way back in 1994. Train crashes, air crashes, bombings like 9/11, or the combined effects, what happened in the 9/11 in US. Mass disaster or a major incident is any emergency that requires the implementation of special arrangements by one or more of the emergency services or the local authority. For there are 5 objectives for that: the initial treatment, rescue and transport of large number of casualties, the involvement either directly or indirectly of large number of people, the handling of a large number of inquiries likely to be generated both from the public and the news media, usually to the police, the need for the large scale combined resources of 2 or more of the emergency services, the mobilization and organization of the emergency services and supporting organizations, for example local authority, with the aim to cater for the threat of death, serious injury or homelessness to a large number of people. Now, to handle disaster situation, it has been advocated to form disaster victim identification commissions, DVI commissions. In order to achieve, maintain and improve standards and facilitate international liaison, Interpol recommends that each member country establish one or more permanent disaster victim identification commissions. They should have a responsibility not only for disaster response but also for the vital functions of pre-planning and training of key personals who may, by virtue of their position, suddenly become involved in or responsible for one or more of the many aspects of a disaster, including victim identification. Now let us see the identification methods. Accurate identification is achieved by matching antemortem and postmortem data which is obtained from circumstantial evidence like clothing, jewelry and the pocket contents, or the physical evidence which is provided by either by external examination as well as internal examination. External examination like general features and specific features, the most important one is the fingerprints. The internal examination, when the doctor performs, so the medical evidence, the dental evidence as well as the associated laboratory findings. Now the personal effects. The description of clothing, jewelry and pocket contents should be recorded first when we examine the body, because they may assist in the correct identification provided a detailed and reliable antemortem description of the same objects can be obtained for the comparison. It must be borne in mind that loose objects can easily be attributed to the wrong body, whether by mistake or maybe intentional. So personal effects may constitute valuable circumstantial evidence of identity, but never proof. They are merely factors which, combined with others, make a case for positive identification. The police may insist that personal property like jewelry, watches, documents, clothing, they must be examined by a forensic science laboratory to assist with identification as well as the investigations. Then the examination of the body proper, that is the external examination and internal examination. In external examination, the identification of an unknown body should primarily be based on the physical evidence derived from the body itself. Searching for and describing physical features is the best undertaken by a police officer who is familiar with obtaining descriptions, working with a medical expert such as a police surgeon or a forensic expert. As the identification process will also normally involve establishing the cause of death, a forensic expert must participate in the removal and description of clothing and body features. Such involvement will help in interpreting the injuries found and possibly assist in determining the cause of death as well. It is important that the undressing of the bodies and the external and internal examination form a continuous and structured process. General features of the naked body should then be described, including sex, estimated age, height, build, color of skin, all these. Some features, for example, hair and eye color, are a matter of judgment and may therefore be potentially inaccurate. Taken together with other details, however, they can lead to a positive identification. Specific features such as scars, moles, tattoos and abnormalities are often unique and thus extremely important if they can be matched with the antematter data. Fingerprints are specific external features. If present on a body and if antematter prints can be obtained for comparison, they constitute the safest identification means available. They should always be recorded by an expert. Internal examination: in some countries, external examination is sufficient evidence of the cause of death. But if a victim's identity or cause of death cannot be determined from an external examination, an autopsy may be necessary. The victim identification cannot be considered as an end in itself. It is an integral and essential part of the overall investigation of the disaster. It should therefore be standard practice to perform autopsies on all disaster victims, not only for the identification and cause of death aspects, but also to assist in preventing or minimizing the effects of similar incidents in the future. It will always be responsibility of the medical experts who are duty bound by the legal requirements to perform complete autopsy in a country like ours in India. At the examiner's discretion, specimens and samples may need to be taken for further specialist investigation. The medical experts may require that blood types be established or that body fluids be examined for traces of alcohol, drug, carbon monoxide, etc., or that tissue samples be microscopically examined in serology, toxicology or pathology laboratories. There may be medical findings which will assist with the identification. For example, signs of previous fractures or surgery, or the missing organs like appendix, uterus or kidney, or presence of implants. Then dental examination. Dental evidence is a particularly important and effective method of identification and can often be so accurate that it will positively identify an individual by itself. The examination of teeth and jaws can only be properly carried out by a forensic odontologist who will perform the oral examination as part of the general autopsy. Because of the exact detail which can be obtained from this examination, it is accepted procedure for dental experts, when necessary, to remove teeth for sectioning and age evaluation, or jaws, complete or in part, for maceration and radiography at the forensic dental laboratories. Radiology, of course, will be of great advantage in both internal examination as well as dental examination, particularly when an estimate of a victim's age is required, and also to discover fractures or other unique identification information. The X-ray examination is also a very effective method of locating and identifying evidential materials such as bullets or bomb fragments. X-ray equipment, preferably portable, should always be made available in the temporary mortuary at least. The genetic identification. This technique provides a powerful diagnostic tool in the forensic medicine and can successfully be applied to the identification of disaster victims. An individual's genetic data is the same in all cells and remains constant even after death. The analysis of a biological sample makes it possible to link an individual to ancestors and descendants, and the data from these analyses can easily be computerized. The genetic identification techniques currently in use complement other methods commonly used for DVI, especially when a body has been severely mutilated. The biological sample analysis can result in the genetic linking of a victim to members of his natural family, the conclusion that victims were not related, or the matching of the body parts. The sampling must be carried out on all the victims. It must be remembered, however, that attempts to link a victim with his father or children involve the risk of proving non-paternity. Obtaining, storing and analyzing these samples from both the victim and potential relative requires special expertise and should always be undertaken by a scientific or medical expert. The expert advice should also be sought on the most appropriate method of forwarding the samples to their destination to ensure that security and integrity are maintained. Then coming on to the victim identification. In order to identify disaster victims, two different set of data have to be collected. One is data on the missing persons, another is the data on bodies recovered from the site. Data on missing persons, that is persons known or thought to have been present when the disaster occurred and are not listed as survivors. Then there should be a missing persons branch, and which should be established under the command of an antemartum data coordinator or to deal with the antemartum record and files. The primary function of the missing persons branch will be to provide a reliable victim list as soon as possible. Then there is antemartum records unit. The DVI form as guided by the Interpol should be used by this unit to record antemartum data for all persons reported as possible victims of the disaster. It is observed that the number of persons reported as potential victims invariably massively exceeds the number actually involved. An early decision will therefore have to be made on whether to record the data given in the initial reports on the DVI forms immediately, or to begin using the forms only when there is some evidence of a person's presence. It is essential that as much detail as possible is obtained and recorded during the first interview with relatives, friends, etc., and that the identity of the person making the report, that is the informant, and the particulars of how they can be contacted in the future are recorded as well. It may be necessary to contact that person at a later stage to give or obtain further information. It is equally important to ask informants to report again immediately if they receive any news about the assumed victims, for example that the person has returned home or is otherwise accounted for. When specific medical or dental information is required, it is important to obtain the names and addresses of family doctors and dentists, all present and past, together with as many details as possible of the medical and dental history. Advice on the type of details required should be sought from the doctors and dentists attached to the antemartum files unit. It may be advantageous to indicate the nationality or the state of the missing persons by adding the identification letters used on the vehicle registration plates, for example DL for Delhi, UP for Uttar Pradesh, etc. A system of collating the data they provide will have to be established at the missing persons unit. When all available information has been recorded, it must be transferred to the antemartum file section. Now coming on to the antemartum files unit. This unit will file all antemartum reports by family name alphabetically. It would be advisable to computerize this function in order to facilitate searching, storing the information and checking for double reporting. That is, the persons reported more than once, so prior training is therefore needed. The antemartum files unit is responsible for checking that all antemartum reports are complete after obtaining any missing data. It may be necessary to form relative liaison teams comprising local police officers in the different countries concerned if it is a disaster involving many countries, or in order to obtain further information that is missing data, photograph, medical records, etc. If a potential victim's fingerprints are not already on record, attempts may have to be made to obtain such prints from the person's home or his workplace. It may be necessary to set up an antepartum fingerprint unit to work on this problem in close cooperation with the postmortem fingerprint unit. Medical records are confidential documents and should be handled very carefully. An antepartum medical unit and an antepartum dental unit should be set up, staffed by qualified doctors and dentists who are entitled to read the records and are also capable of interpreting and extracting relevant information. These expert groups will need to cooperate closely with the corresponding postmortem medical and dental personnel. A firm chain of command is essential. If plans do not provide for a senior officer, for example, Commissioner of Police, to take immediate control, an investigator in charge must be appointed to assume overall responsibility for the whole operation. Until sufficient additional officers become available, he may need to direct and supervise many, if not all, of the initial aspects of the response. For effective control and coordination of the various activities, the investigator in charge will need at least 3 assistants, each responsible for a major aspect of the overall operation. And these assistants may be called as a Director of Communication, Director of Rescue Operations, as well as the Director of Victim Identification. The victims list. The immediate responsibility of the antepartum files unit will be to compile as reliable a victim list as possible. In the case of a commercial aircraft crash, for example, a passenger list may quickly become available from the carrier, but in other circumstances, it will usually take a considerable time before such a list can be established. Caution should always be exercised about the accuracy of any passenger list provided, as experience has shown that there are often inaccuracies for a number of reasons. The total number of presumed victims is extremely important because any decision to stop searching must take into consideration the question of whether the number of survivors and the number of bodies recovered matches the number of people on the victims list or not. Perhaps the simplest and most obvious way to begin compiling an accurate victim list is to list all those potentially involved, to list those known to have survived, whether injured or not, and then to subtract list B from list A. This gives a reasonable starting point. When the total number of dead victims has been established, the antepartum file units will be able to assess whether the number of bodies plus survivors matches the number on the list of passengers or residents supplied. So there will of course be by many incidents where it is simply not possible to assess the number of victims accurately, for example in cases of widespread natural disasters. Then there is a victim checkpoint. It will be helpful to record details of all survivors before they leave the incident site at a victim checkpoint. All bodies and parts brought to the victim checkpoint or first aid station must be given a reference number before removal to a temporary holding area or the mortuary. Injured person may die in ambulances or at first aid facilities. So their bodies must be numbered and moved directly to the mortuary setup for the incident or the body holding area to make certain that they are not lost or forgotten. Victim recovery. The recovery of dead victims does not start until the rescue of all survivors has been completed. The rescue team should be instructed to leave dead bodies and dead body parts untouched. But many bodies and much evidence may justifiably be removed during attempts to save lives and effect rescues. Body recovery should also be considered as part of the process of locating and safeguarding evidence. It is important for accurate records to be kept under supervision of a recovery coordinator. Coming on to the photography unit. The photographic personnel should be deployed at the earliest opportunity to record the scene and all activities. Photographic and video recording of the bodies at the disaster site and within the mortuary is important both for the evidence and because in many cases it can help the experts to establish the cause of the incidents. The photographer should therefore be attached to search and recovery teams and work in conjunction with them. The body reference number must be clearly visible on each exposure and these must be the only numbers used. it should not be necessary to remove body numbers during photography. But if circumstances make this unavoidable, the photographer must be responsible for making certain that the correct number is reattached immediately after photographs have been taken. So bodies will also need to be photographed at the mortuary, preferably by a separate photographic officer or team to avoid any risk of contamination. However, only one number must still be used for each body. The use of additional reference numbers will lead to confusion. A photographer or many photographers should be responsible for completing the relevant part of the DVI PM form and for processing exposed films. The importance of photographs, films and videos cannot be overemphasized. In addition to being an aid to the investigation, they will also provide a clear record of events which will be extremely helpful for debriefing, for analyzing procedures and performance and for subsequent training. Then coming on to the morgue station. The morgue station is an interim holding area for bagged bodies and body parts until transport can be arranged and the mortuary is ready to receive them. Once the mortuary branch has become operational, the recovery coordinator will authorize and supervise the transfer. The morgue station will keep its own record of bodies received and stored, listing each body reference number, the date and time of receipt, from whom received and where stored. Subsequently, details of the transfer, that is when, by whom, the mortuary to which the body was taken and the vehicle used for transport should be recorded. Release section and return to the identification file section afterwards. This can be further divided into director of identification, which is responsible for with the help at the scene with the mortuary coordinator, and they form the team leaders, and there is a body reception area, body movement, a property officer, a fingerprint officer, a photographer, and there is a medical examination. And at the body reception area, the logging of the body should be done, the body storage should be done, the property officer which will search the bodies, the fingerprint officer will fill the fingerprint forms, the photographer will photograph before and after clothing has been removed in consultation with the medical examination. Simultaneously, the dental examination is also going on, and then afterwards embalming is done, and again the photographs is taken, the records are maintained, and then afterwards this is sent to the identification center where it is done, the antemartum and postmortem data matching is done, and when the identification is confirmed, then it is sent to the body release unit. This can be very easily understood by the flow chart. To summarize this, disaster victim identification part 1 is normally the responsibility of the police, is a difficult and demanding exercise which can only be brought to a successful conclusion if properly planned, and which has to involve the active participation of many other agencies. In order to achieve, maintain and improve standards and facilitate international liaison, Interpol recommends that each member country should establish one or more permanent DVI commissions. In some countries, an external examination is sufficient evidence of the cause of death, but if a victim's identity or cause of death cannot be determined from an external examination, an autopsy may be necessary. In India, however, complete autopsy is legally required. Radiology will be of great advantage in both internal and dental examinations, particularly when an estimate of victim's age is required, and also to discover fractures or other unique identification information. The rescue team should also be instructed to leave dead bodies and body parts untouched, but many bodies and much evidence may justifiably be moved during attempts to save lives and effect rescues.